I want to thank Matthew, of course, for inviting me for that kind introduction. I first met Matthew, came into contact with Matthew because you were the reviewer on my first book, or one of the reviewers on my first book. And that must have been around 2000 or something like that. And then you've been most kind to invite me to Canberra a few years ago, and now this time to Brisbane when I'm here. So thank you for taking an interest in my work. So I'm going to talk about my book, Making Marie Curie, which was published in 2015. The paperback was out in a year after, published by University of Chicago Press. And I haven't talked for a long time about Curie, actually, so this is a way of revisiting some of the questions that I worked on for a couple of years, which is good, to be able to rethink or reframe some of these questions. And I've timed myself at 45 minutes, but sometimes I tend to digress, so I've asked Matthew to keep a track on this. I'm not sure if the format allows for interrupting while I speak, but I hope we'll have time for questions afterwards. Yeah. So this talk is a mongrel, in a sense, because I'm obviously here to talk about Curie, but I also want to talk about the genre that I've been working in this book. So what does it mean to write something that is not a biography, but that sort of looks at intellectual property through the lens of a particular person. So I want to talk a bit about the genre of writing. And also say something about, because this book has led me to the project that I'm working on right now that Matthew mentioned very briefly on patents as scientific information. Most of my career then, Matthew didn't say this, but I have a PhD in comparative literature. So I'm a humanities person. I've never held a position in comparative literature. I've been a professor of library and information science, a discipline that I have no training in. And I'm currently professor of mediated culture, which is absolutely no discipline at all, just happens to be this really nice professorship that I landed a couple of years ago. But during that whole period, which is basically 20 years, I've always worked on intellectual property. So I started out working on copyright history. I moved into public domain issues, and I'm now working in patents. And I've almost, I can't say that I've done my career on monographs, but monographs has been my preferred way of writing. And for Making Marie Curie, I was delighted to have a wonderful designer who did the book. So the book was actually up for an award in the US. The university presses have this award system. So it was up for an award. I didn't win, but it was still shortlisted for the best cover of that year, which was really nice. And on the other side, you can see the front paper of my latest article. So you can think about the materiality of producing research. You know, books have this wonderful materiality if you're lucky. And then now I only produce articles, and of course they look like this, and it's a big difference. So maybe I get a chance to return to books, I hope. I have a project in mind about champagne, which is my dream project, and that is going to be, for obvious reasons, and that is going to be a book, I hope. But that's a long time ahead. So I always enjoyed writing books, but I enjoy writing even articles. I enjoy writing even articles. So what comes to mind when you see this image? If anybody wants to raise their hand, that's fine. You don't have to overthink it probably, but what possibly comes to mind is another image of 4 women. So Marilyn Monroe, there's Elizabeth Taylor, Jacqueline Kennedy, and Blondie, or Deborah Harry. Very familiar iconography for celebrities that Andy Warhol colored into fame. Now, I have no idea of knowing how the European Union thought when they once, and this is a while back, commissioned this image for the Marie Curie Actions research program, but in all likelihood they had in mind that she represented a kind of celebrity status that would be understood in the same kind of coloring as the Warhol ladies. It is likely, however, that foremost in their mind was this idea of Marie Curie being the ultimate symbol of research excellence, even, of course, a nifty gendered and inclusive symbol of European research excellence. Now, for the Horizon 2020, I'm not sure how familiar you are with European research funding, but of course we have these huge research platforms, and the current one is the Horizon 2020. It's now being phased out for a new research platform. But more recently, Marie Curie has, of course, become Marie Sklodowska-Curie for the same program. So her Polish name has been sort of reintroduced more forcefully in Europe than it has before. So she's no longer reserved for France, although I believe her, for various reasons, France is a stronger, perhaps, investment for Curie than Poland, even if Poland tries its best. But she epitomizes sort of both the East and the West of Europe, which of course is also a good thing for the European Union. So it's very difficult actually to think of Curie without thinking of Poland and France. And there are many symbolic interventions on behalf of both these countries in various ways to claim Marie Curie as their own. So she's definitely used by the European Union in this projection of what European science is, or excellence in European science. And of course, the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Actions is a mobility program. So it's about having people move, which of course is another good illustration of her own trajectory. I hope you can see some of this. So Curie is European. She's East and West, but she's still more French in a sense. And in 2005, together with Pasteur, she made the list of the greatest Frenchmen of all time. Now it's too far away for me but I've circled. So Pasteur is on second place, and I think Curie is on fourth place. And for those of you who might know something of French culture, it's really funny that the person who comes after her is Coluche, this famous French comedian who's sort of, he comes before Victor Hugo on this list. So it's a kind of amusing list. But you have two scientists at least topping, the most famous Frenchmen of all time. So at the same time as Curie has come to represent excellence in science, or being used to represent excellence in science, she has also been turned into a brand. And this is an old image taken from when I was working on the book, then 2010, something like that. And it's the Marie Curie Actions on Facebook. So when the Marie Curie Actions became, or put up information on Facebook. So it says here that since 1st of February, I can't remember the exact year, the Marie Curie Actions will be on Facebook to get across with young researchers and students and to further spread out the Marie Curie brand. So it's not the Marie Curie Action Program brand, but it's the Marie Curie brand. And I think it's quite a fascinating way to formulate the kind of values that are associated with Marie Curie. So on the one hand, research excellence, disinterest, openness, sharing, and on the other hand, this language or rhetoric of intellectual property. So it's not the Marie Curie Actions Program brand, but it is in fact the Marie Curie brand. So it represents something. So this use of Marie Curie as an example, as a role model, as a celebrity within the official framework of the EU is one way in which Curie circulates and one way in which Curie is constantly made and remade. And the interesting thing, I think, with this juxtaposition of, on the one hand, a particular kind of scientific ethos, and on the other hand, this brand or this way in which science is becoming packaged as a particular kind of value that we can think of as a brand. In 2009, Loreal commissioned a poll from the New Scientist to answer the question, who is the most inspirational female scientist? Now, this might seem an unlikely survey for a cosmetic giant, if not for the fact that it was sponsored by the L'Oreal UNESCO for Women in Science program, which is actually a very successful and increasingly important program in order to promote women in science on all levels. So the program was founded in 1998 on the premise that the world needs science and science needs women. Basically demolishing the competition, it was no great surprise that Marie Curie came out victorious, beating the British biophysicist Rosalind Franklin in second place with almost twice as many votes, and placing the ancient mathematician philosopher Hypatia in a very distant third place. So this is a kind of weird, you have Hypatia and Rosalind Franklin and Marie Curie, but it's very obvious that in terms of being inspirational, Curie can hold her own, and she's still, and this is an image of her that I will return to. There has been a backlash toward, I'll mention it very briefly. A few years ago, a book was published called the Madame Curie Complex, which basically argued that Marie Curie is standing in the way of a greater understanding of women in science, so that she's held up as this role model, as this unique person in a sense, which makes us see her in ways that we don't see other women who has been successful in science. Whether or not this is a tenable argument is perhaps not something that we can discuss today, but there is a kind of Curie backlash, if you will. So Curie remains, alongside this man, Albert Einstein, the most instantly recognizable face of modern science. In terms of celebrity science or celebrity status, they are absolutely in a league of their own. Having first met in 1909, they were on friendly terms, professionally and privately. In 1913, they even vacationed together in the Swiss Alps. Now, this picture is taken a few years later, probably around the 1920s, but in the same Swiss Alps. The occasion was a meeting with the League of Nations Commission Internationale de Coopération Intellectuelle, where they were both members. So together with 10 more eminent scholars, diplomats, and scientists, they served in an advisory capacity to the League's Assembly and Council in all matters that had to do with intellectual cooperation, a topic that was given the highest priority after the Great War. So Einstein was a bit reluctant to participate. He didn't go to all the meetings. Curie did, and often tried to get him more involved. In Einstein, Curie saw an ally when it came to science and international collaboration. But primarily, he was perhaps the only one who really understood fame and how his fame was on par with her own, and who knew exactly what she meant when she warily asked him in a letter of January 6, 1924, "Don't you sometimes think that it is exasperating not being able to make a gesture without having it take on global significance?" So they actually both understood how famous they were and how much of celebrities they were and how they could work as celebrities. And they shared another experience, and that was the US. I'm not sure if you know this, but Einstein once called the US Dollaria, which is kind of nice, I think. So they both had, partly their celebrity status would be reinforced by a very specific relationship to the US. And I'll talk a bit about Curie's travels to the US in 1921. She made 2 trips to the US, and of course Einstein was there all the time. But the US press, they were smitten with Einstein, but they didn't like Curie. So he was funny. He threw witticisms around him. I mean, I'm sure you've seen all of these images where he bikes, and we'll see an image later on when he sticks out his tongue and all of that. Curie was tired, withdrawn. her brain fagged by the small talk of Americans, as the New York Times wrote with barely concealed irony, on the eve of her departure she really did this breakneck 1921 tour of the US. I've seen her schedule, and it's just, anybody would tire from it. So she was very much admired, but she wasn't in the same league as Einstein, who could kid around and do all of these nice things. She always wore black dresses, and she didn't sit well in a country where celebrity culture really depended on celebrities being willing to play along, or at least to some extent. So Einstein is actually a list regular on Forbes' annual tally of top-earning dead celebrities. And this is from 2012, and I think he landed 7 out of 15 famous deceased who continue to pull in a lot of money from beyond the grave. So he was far behind Michael Jackson and Elvis Presley. He still pulled in a respectable $10 million to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which owns his intellectual property. So there are indeed far more Einstein mugs than there are Curie ties, although there is quite a lot of paraphernalia also around Curie. So the circulation of Curie, to get back to that list of famous Frenchmen, resembles more the circulation of Pasteur. So posterity has mythologized these two French scientists in similar ways. Both have been the objects of successful biographies, authored by close relatives. Her daughter, Eva Curie, who was a journalist, and who wrote Madame Curie, who really is the sort of benchmark biography which, upon most other biographies, have been constructed. It was his son-in-law. So Pasteur's son-in-law wrote La Vie de Pasteur while Pasteur was still alive. Both were immortalized by Hollywood. Pasteur by Paul Muni in the Oscar-awarded The Story of Louis Pasteur from 1936, and Marie Curie, of course, by Greer Garson in the famous 1943 production of Eva Curie's biography, Madame Curie. And of course, there are the ubiquitous street names, parks, schools, squares, and other public places named in France of these two scientists. I'm not sure if I have time to go into detail, but in my book I discuss a lot the way in which Curie understood the value of the name Curie and what the name Curie could be used for, whereas what it could not be used for. So she knew exactly how to navigate the value of the name Curie. But print, of course, remains central, and this goes especially for children's books. I mean, there's an enormous amount of children's books and adolescent books for adolescents on Curie, and this is actually a very interesting, or it could be a very interesting research project in itself, how books for children help to perpetuate a particular idea of what science is or what science should be. So, of course, her claim to fame, rests in part on being the only woman and only one of a handful of laureates in total who have been awarded the Nobel Prize twice. So 1903 together with her husband, Pierre, and 1911 by herself, and in 2 disciplines then, or two fields. So children read about Marie Curie in school. They learn how far perseverance and commitment can take you, even if you're a girl, especially if you're a girl, perhaps. Countless adolescents who dream about life in science still look up to her as a role model. Her own scientific life continues to fascinate and supply a steady demand for new biographies. So there's not a textbook, dictionary, exhaustive encyclopedia of 20th century science that would be considered complete if she wasn't in it. So why then write about Curie if everything has been written, which is an argument that doesn't really fly, but I mean, so much of what has been written about Curie is extremely, perpetuates a very specific image of Curie. of course, then managed mainly by her family, still very much managed by her family, because as you might know, this is not just a woman, a mother, it's the founder of a scientific dynasty in France, which is still very much managing Curie in various ways. So I wasn't interested in writing another biography. I think sometimes people think this is a biography, which it is not. I wanted to use Curie to tell another story. Some people are sensitive when you say that you want to use Curie to do something else, because it's still, you know, this towering person that you cannot do everything with. But my own interest in Curie began with the decision not to patent radium or the processes of its extraction. So this is still one of the most famous decisions in the history of science. So because I had begun to move from an interest in copyright and more to an interest of science and patents and the understanding of intellectual property in research, I was intrigued by this negation of patenting, which is hardly a revolutionary stance, but I was still interested in the negation of patenting, partly because it seemed so refreshingly out of sync then with the present situation of patent or perish, basically. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to go through each chapter. There's only 4 chapters, so I won't go into that great detail, but I'll zero in on what each chapter tells about Curie from the perspective of intellectual property or from the perspectives that I had chosen for the book, which was IP, celebrity culture, and also information, or the rise of information as an important, which was partly some of what I talked about yesterday. I'll probably devote a bit longer to the first chapter, which is really about how a scientific persona comes about, or how you use print in order to consolidate and manage, self-fashion yourself. And then I'll say something more at the very end on how this project then led up to what I'm currently working on, this big patent project that I have. So I never set out to write a biography. I never set out to find the unknown Curie in any way. There are several very good biographies of Curie. This was not my end game at all. I worked with a chronological narrative, so the chapters do follow in a chronological order, but it's extremely selective. So it could have been other events in her life. I could have probably made the same argument with other events, but I chose 4 that I thought also told a story about science during the 20th century, or the way in which science has developed. My work I wouldn't say that I'm a microhistorian. It's a kind of weird designation, but I'm very fond of microhistory as a way of working with materials. So this is a definition of microhistory as the intensive historical investigation of a relatively well-defined smaller object or single event. In this case, I wouldn't say that the object is in focus. I'm currently at the ISHTIP conference in Sydney, which was last week. I presented an article on an envelope that I'm working on right now. So that's a smaller object. In this case, I talk about various events or single events in her life. I'm very fond of this way of working because for me, it's the way of working that opens up for bigger issues, but that ties it to something that is very concrete. So it's a way I enjoy working in that way. So the first chapter, Me, Myself, I, in the interest of disinterestedness, is about this famous decision, but it's also about how a scientist constructs herself and what can delimit or open up for such a construction. This is an image of the famous laboratory where the discovery and later isolation of radium took place in 1898. And 1902, I think. Should know this. So this, of course, the laboratory is such a central idea to the history of science. It's really the crucial place. And we have all of these ideas about how a laboratory should look, and this looks nothing like what we think a laboratory should look like. But this is exactly part of the construction of the myth around the Curies, is of course that they got this shed, this derelict shed, on the premises of the school where Pierre Curie was employed. And he worked not at one of the famous universities or Sorbonne or anything, but he worked for this polytechnic, basically. And they were tinkering around with all this material, and they needed somewhere to do it, and they got this shed on the premises of the school. And it's part of the whole imagery of Curie as this hard, toiling scientist who really works with material, that is really doggedly pursuing this idea of radium and the material in a shed that is completely, the wrong kind of place to be. So, Marie Curie and Pierre Curie are celebrities basically from the time that they get the first Nobel Prize, so 1903. And the image of the husband and wife team owes a lot to this famous Vanity Fair caricature from 1904. And there are fascinating at-home reportages in French press at the time when the journalists, they go out to Sour, where they lived, which is close, it's not that far from Paris, but at that time it was way out in the sticks. And they go out and they look at this fascinating couple who do this work together, and she's Polish and he's French. He comes from a very odd background, so they're both sort of fascinating creatures for the press to look at, and they have one daughter, I think, at that time. So they go out and they look at these two scientists and they try to figure out, is this possible? Can you have a marriage like this? And can you blah, blah. So basically, they become these huge celebrities from the time that they get or share the Nobel Prize in 1903 with Henri Becquerel. So the words you see at the other end on the other side of the screen are words from almost exactly 20 years later. So these are words by Marie Curie herself, written in a biography of her dead husband, published in 1923. And Pierre Curie died in 1906. He was absent-minded. I mean, that's at least the way he's been described. He was on his way from a meeting to another meeting. He was rushing along the Rue Dauphine, and it had rained, and it was April, and lots of slippery leaves on the ground. And there was this he fell, and there was this horse-drawn carriage that just ran over him, and he died immediately. His head was crushed. So Marie Curie was 39. She had 2 young daughters, and she became a widow. So after that, after his death, Marie Curie becomes this huge figure, also in the shadow of Pierre Curie. That's very important to remember, and it has so Pierre Curie is always a presence in the construction of Curie, but he's a presence as a dead, as a dead person, as a person who no longer lives. In 1920, Marie Curie was approached by Perriot, a famous French publisher, and she was asked to write a biography of her husband. So 20 years later, the publisher comes to her and says, would you like to write the biography of your husband? And she accepted, because I think she was given an opportunity also to talk about herself, which was far more complicated in the French culture of that time. So it was okay to talk about Pierre Curie, obviously, but it was more complicated to talk about herself. So given an opportunity to write about her husband, she could also set the record straight about her own involvement in this, one of the 20th century's biggest scientific discoveries. So we have a super famous team, and this quote is one of the few openly programmatic statements we have about how Curie how they viewed their own scientific ethos, if you will, or how they viewed this decision not to patent. And I looked at, this is a parenthesis, in the Curie archives, that much of it is digitized, partly because it was radioactive actually for a very long time, so it was restricted access to the material, but partly, of course, because this is a huge French cultural heritage. But I've looked at the drafts in the BNF, and so I looked at, there are 3 drafts in which she ends up, and I'm not sure if you've ever worked with drafts, or, you know, can be a really fantastic material to work with, because you can see how something ends up in print, how it becomes this story. So she weighs, in the draft you can see how she weighs, am I going to be me? Is it going to be me? Is it going to be us? Is it going to be a collective endeavor? So, but this is how it ends up. And I'll read it, and it says, our investigations had started a general scientific movement, and similar work was being undertaken in other countries. Toward these efforts, Pierre Curie maintained a most disinterested and liberal attitude. With my agreement, he refused to draw any material profit from our discovery. We took no copyright. Please note that this is a mistranslation from the French. In the French, it's brevet, so patents. Here, it becomes copyright. And published without reserve all the results of our research, as well as the exact processes of the preparation of radium. In addition, we gave to those interested whatever information they asked of us. This was of great benefit to the radium industry, which could thus develop in full freedom, first in France, then in foreign countries, and furnish to scientists and to physicians the products which they needed. This industry still employs today, with scarcely any modifications, the processes indicated by us. So 20 years after the fact, this is the way in which it's becoming packaged by Curie. So as she enumerates the do's and the don'ts, Curie situated scientific practice within this gift-market dichotomy. So you uphold 2 distinct systems of reward, credit and reward. Intellectual property represented an interested perspective where you reserve advantage. Choosing to publish without reserve and keeping no detail secret instead epitomized the values of disinterestedness. Abstaining from proprietary shackles on radium spurned more innovative activity in both science and industry, and not less. So this is as close as we get to a last will and testament about the discovery of radium and the science of radioactivity, nailing down the leitmotif that is then being transported into the image we have of Curie today as a representative of disinterested science. Material profit was refused, but publishing took place without reserve. No advantage was secured in industrial application, but no detail was kept secret, and information was given freely. If you try and look beyond the sort of altruistic surface, you can find a remarkably strong claim to radium. So everything here in the science and industry of radium begins and ends with the Curies. They are the privileged node in this expanding radium network, the initiators, the parents, the authors, and the uncontested authority on radium. So there might be no ownership to radium, but they still have a sort of ownership or a claim to a particular kind of status on radium. So when Marie Curie writes this, she had lived and worked without her original research partner for almost 20 years. In 1923, she was more famous than Pierre Curie had ever been, and he was pretty famous too when he was alive. So although she was commissioned to write his life, she could hardly erase herself completely when accounting for, the scientific ethos of disinterestedness. So instead, she would choose words that almost made it look as if her husband had asked her for permission to enforce the principle of non-patenting in practice. So with my agreement, sort of suggests that the final disinterested word came from Marie rather than Pierre Curie. He refused to draw any material profit. He, not we, refused to make profit from what was our discovery, etc., etc. So it's an interesting way of looking at, who could actually claim something here to this particular discovery. She was very right, at least, in saying that only one person in this collaboration could profit or choose not to profit from the discovery, and that person was her husband. The Code Civil at the time of the Curie's marriage did not recognize her as a legal person. So in fact, when the Curies were awarded the Nobel Prize in chemistry with Becquerel in 1903, she was, together with all married women, children, and the insane, judged incapacité. So during the period that she rose to prominence as a scientific author, as a celebrity, co-discoverer of radium, author of many scientific papers, and Nobel Prize recipient, she could not own any of the intellectual property that led her to those achievements or that resulted from them. I'm not trying to, actually I've seen people interpret what I wrote as saying that this affected her, profoundly in the way that I don't believe that, but I do believe that it's quite interesting to think about what the category of person and personhood, legal personhood, means in terms of the way in which she was able to construct herself as an authority at the time. So crediting Marie Curie's legal status as a married woman under the Code Civil, she could never vote, for instance. The French didn't institute general voting for women until 1948 or something like that. So there's lots of things she could not do. And I think what it can do, or what it can do for a researcher, is to open up a new sort of interpretive horizon. So what happens if we think about what she could or could not do from a perspective of legal personhood, for instance. She may have been the world's first female Nobel Prize recipient, but she had few legal entitlements. She couldn't sign a contract. She couldn't exercise control over her own grants. So during the period when she becomes this public figure that we think we know, her formal presence in the public sphere is more that of a shadow, in a sense. Of course, few today remember that Marie Curie wrote the biography of her dead husband, and fewer still have probably read it. But Pierre Curie is actually a really interesting and seminal, the publication of Pierre Curie is really an interesting and seminal moment in the construction of Marie Curie. So the biography genre, the genre of scientific biographies is quite interesting to look at in ways, in how it also constructs the idea of science and what it means to be a scientist. And of course, the biography genre is loved by the general audience, viewed with a certain disdain in academic circles, but continues then to operate, have a large readership, I would say. That's another talk. But it suffices to say that what we know of the Curies has been carefully filtered down to us through this orchestrated narrative by the dramatis persona themselves. So Pierre Curie is one such text through which Curie herself becomes visible, or in which she sort of orchestrates the idea of the Curies. Her own carefully controlled autobiographical notes, only published in English as part of the Macmillan Company American edition from 1923, is another. And you can see, I hope you can see this, but the image to the left is then the American edition, which was a highly troublesome work for Curie, but there she is, I think it says it's written by Marie Curie. But the French, she is Madame Curie, not Marie Curie. So the way in which she entered into different authorship personas, depending on where this story was published. So in America, she is Marie Curie. She is this independent woman. But in France, she would always be the widow of Pierre Curie. So this creates different kinds of authorship strategies in terms of But it was an important moment when I worked on making Marie Curie, when I read the work of legal scholar Cheryl Hamilton, who is in Canada, who's written a really good book on legal personhood, because it was an avenue of research I hadn't really thought about before. So, which to me then, to hold property, to be a person, all of those things I had, in a sense, taken for granted. And then I stumbled across Curie, and I stumbled across this notion that personhood could be something quite different. And that was very important for me in terms of understanding Curie. So the property road, if you want to put it that way, may have been close to her, but the persona road was not. So the culturally produced trace a copy of the person in order to create the persona, or in order to create Marie Curie in different ways. And I think this is an extremely complex affair, how she does it, but one way of looking at it is, of course, the we and the me and the I and the us, and how this partnership is constructed. And I believe that she was far more complicit and far more active in shaping the image of Curie than we might previously have thought. We tend to think that Curie is always subjected to something rather than being subject herself, who can manipulate herself. But I think she could manipulate and has manipulated the understanding of the Curie name a lot. So the name is central in all of this, and I have for a long time wanted to write an article about a fascinating letter in the Curie archives, which is just a few months before she dies, and the letter comes from a lawyer, and I've actually now, his son has, for various reasons, I've gotten into contact with, and it concerns the wonderful not from Curie's perspective, but it concerns the quack, Alfred Curie, who happened to share the same name as Curie, but of course, was no relation. But Alfred Curie had this range of beauty products called Thoradia, which were marketed as radium, on the basis of radium as a really nice property to have. And if you Google, in Google Patents, you can Google radium, or you can find all sorts of absolutely fascinating patented inventions that are constructed to get as much radium into you as possible. So at this time, radium was perceived of as something really important or good, beneficial. So you have radioactive underwear, for instance, is the other example. So radium really is this fantastic thing because of the fluorescence or because of the light and everything. So it is deemed beneficial rather than dangerous, of course. And Curie, in 1930, she is desperately seeking legal advice on what to do with Alfred Curie, because obviously he has nothing to do with the family, but he's destroying, the most important name or the most important legacy in scientific history. In the second chapter, Scandal, Slander, and Science, Surviving 1911, and I presented this work the first time in 2010 in Melbourne, actually, which was kind of nice. And it concerns a very specific year in Curie's life, which is 1911, and the 5 duels that were fought over her in November, December of that year in Paris. So the year begins, and I'm sorry if you can't see this image, but it's an absolutely fantastic image. To the left, it says, the photographer is without pity, and it actually shows paparazzi photographers outside of her laboratory in Paris in January of 1911. She has tried to enter the most sacrosanct of French institutions, the French Academy of Science. Had she been successful, she would have been the first woman, of course, in the Academy of Science. As it turned out, her campaign would be unsuccessful, and it would be a huge scandal covered in the press, etc., etc. So January 1911, and she never retried. Her husband, tried 4 times or 5 times before he got into the academy, but she was deeply hurt, or at least that's how the history goes, so she never retried the candidacy. And I think we have to wait until 1970 something for a woman to enter the French Academy of Science. So she was distraught by this. But the scandal that erupted at the end of the year, which is illustrated here by a spoof on how the Sun or any modern tabloid perhaps would frame this, concerns her affair with a married and equally famous scientist, Paul Langevin. They knew each other very well. Of course, she had been a widow for 5 years. He was married. That was not a problem in the French context, with 4 children. And they had an affair, a romantic affair. They had a pied-à-terre close to Sorbonne, and they wrote letters to each other. And to make a very intricate and fascinating story short, these letters were stolen, and they were held up to her as extortion during a period, saying that, you know, if you don't do this, we will publish them and make them public. And the drivers in all of this is the right, a very specific French journal or daily paper called L'Action Française, which is this anti-Semitic, nationalistic, royalistic, awful daily paper, who sort of is the one, they're the ones holding this up to her and saying we're going to publish. And of course she declines, she doesn't want to get involved, she takes her usual stance. Anyway, everything blows up, the letters become published, these cause a huge scandal, and it causes 5 duels in November and December of 1911. 4 with épée, and 1 with pistols. And you can read about it in the book if you want. But so, and this has been captured on newsreels. So I'll show you a bit of this. And so the duels were all fought between newspaper editors, and this is not very uncommon at the time. Nor were duels, of course, but the point of the duel is not to kill someone, obviously, it's to draw blood, and it's to defend or counter honor. So this says is that this is the first duel between Léon Daudet, who was of L'Action Française, this right-wing Semitic newspaper, and Cherbet from Gil Blas, which was a newspaper that defended her. So you can say that it was, you know, editors for or against. And it says here, suite à la polémique sur le comportement de Marie Curie. So it has to do with the polemic that ensued around her behavior. So her behavior is at stake. Obviously, she can't enter into a duel because women never dueled. And she doesn't really have anyone who can enter on her behalf until the final duel, where Langevin actually goes out with a pistol. And that is a white duel, so there's, you know, the classic image of the stepping away from each other and then turning, and they lower their guns, so no shots were fired. But he came to her defense, in a sense. Anyway, this is, and I just have to say, while I was working on the book, I talked to one of my best friends on the telephone, and I said, "Did you know that there was these 5 duels around? Can you imagine?" And she said, "I know. I'm watching it right now." And I said, "What do you mean you're watching it?" So she was the one who had found the clips on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube and you write "Duels 1911 Curie," you will find. But this is at least what Gaumont captured. I'm not sure if you can see much, but you can always consult it later on if you... Oh, I'm not. And of course, they talk to each other and all chummy afterwards. So it's the duel is a fascinating history, actually. Anyway. Enormous scandal, the Swedish, and in all of this, she receives her second Nobel Prize. And the Swedish Academy of Sciences, they're cool for a while, and then as the scandal ensues, they contact her and say, you better not come to Stockholm to get the prize because the scandal is just too much. But she went. And then she had a breakdown after that and went into hiding for a while. So the 1911 events really caused a breakdown, but after the war, Curie was a superstar. She was a superstar in Europe, and she would embark on 2 trips to the US, the first of which took place in 1921, and it's really, you see now I'm digressing, this is why it takes longer. But the purpose of this trip was to receive 1 gram of radium, given to her by the Women of America, who by popular subscription had collected $100,000 for its purchase. Now this is as if we had a crowdsourcing campaign today, which would do a second Nobel Prize in terms of money. So a huge crowdsourcing campaign, and it really was the work of this woman to the right, Missy Brown Maloney, who was editor of a woman's magazine. And it's remarkable that nothing has been done on this woman. She's really a sort of big enabler. They become friends. She's also a big enabler of Curie's research in ways that we might not think about research funding. But she had a tremendous network of rich diplomats, friends, Fifth Avenue people, who were, as she was, she idolized Curie, actually. And it's very difficult to overestimate the role that she played in sending money, instruments, all sorts of scientific resources to Curie. So the final chapter is called Intellectuals of the World Unite, Curie and the League of Nations, and this concerns the last decade of her life and the work she did as part of this Commission Internationale de Coopération Intellectuelle. And it's a really a wonderful, this is the work that led me to where I am right now, so there is a direct link, I would say, between the work in this chapter and what I'm working on right now. But the Commission quickly identified 3 areas that they wanted to work with that they saw as particularly relevant after the war to rebuild the international community. And it was inter-university relations, which is kind of says what it is, and it might be sort of self-evident or obvious. Bibliography, question of bibliography, or how to find information, which is something that she's really concerned with because she wants to know what is happening in other laboratories internationally and how are you to find that information. So abstracting, all sorts of aspects that have to do with bibliography. And then there was scientific property, which is which I've worked on quite a lot, which is a really super controversial scheme to push protection back into discoveries, basically, which never flies, but which is a really interesting historical issue. So this is an example. I showed this image yesterday of how, bibliography at the time, or how information management of the time was something that she was really, really interested in trying to capture. She was also quite interested in scientific property, but that was a bit more controversial because, after all, she was this disinterested scientist. It was difficult for her, perhaps, to be as clear about that as she was about information. So I'm coming to the end. I promise. What did I learn about Marie Curie? Well, what did I learn about intellectual property or science, or all of it, when I wrote this book? Well, first I learned that you cannot do the same things to a female scientist as you can do to a male scientist. And I wrote about an article about this in Social Studies of Science. So, the scientific bibliography has changed a lot, or the biography genre has changed a lot. So we have biographies of cods, we have biographies of, we have lots of scientific biographies that of male scientists that can actually sort of do things with their life and the story of their lives. But it's much more difficult to do something with Curie, because people are very I think the investments in Curie are quite substantial. So we want her, or maybe need her, to be a specific way. And this, I think, is quite interesting, how can you destabilize particular narratives of scientists. I also believe that she was far more extremely aware of her own self-fashioning, so that there are various sorts of reasons why she was this, and why she was very careful to protect the Curie name. It was a real eye-opener for me to think about the way in which Missy Brown Maloney helped shape science, because we don't generally think that the friendship between women in the way that they have something to do with scientific practice. So I thought that was really interesting, and it made me understand and think that science perhaps comes about in ways that we sometimes don't see, and those ways are really interesting to study as well. But I think that the most important lesson, perhaps, or inspiration for my life after Curie, came out of this period with the commission, the tensions between patenting and publishing, which of course had been there all the time. So, the quote that I gave you, a classic quote of choices between patenting or publishing. So I was really interested in that. And so I'll show you, which I think is a wonderful irony. I often show this image. So this is actually the school in Paris. And if you ever get to Paris, there's a wonderful walk in the 5th arrondissement, which is the sort of science arrondissement, where you can walk and see all of these famous buildings and landmarks. And so this is the school where this shed was when they did the discovery. And it's a school which is now called the Paris Tech. So it's rebranded itself into an Anglo-American name. And so what it says here, so the school itself is very careful about its cultural heritage. So it mentions all, Langevin worked there, Curie worked there, we have other Nobel Prize recipients who have worked at the school, so they're very careful about the cultural heritage or the idea of the school. And then it says, today, this culture of excellence is more alive than ever. And it says, the teachers or researchers of the school construct the knowledge of tomorrow, and they publish one article daily in the best scientific journals, and they invent the future or the industry of tomorrow by depositing one patent per week. So this is the school where the history of the Curies, as this disinterested, science appears, and the school is now quantifying and comparing publishing and patenting as if it was, something that we do all the time, as we indeed do. And I was going to say yesterday, I didn't get a chance, but when Uwe talked a bit about patenting and publishing, this is the template for the ERC grant that I hold. So there's a template or a suggestion for how a CV is supposed to be constructed for an application of the kind I did. And it says that granted patents is the third most important output that you can achieve. So which then comes before invented presentations, etc., etc. So, to me, this is there's something in the history of the Curies and the history of how patenting and publishing is part of the scientific project that directly leads into what is happening today and how a school rebrands itself or rethinks its cultural heritage too. So this is what I do, and so this is really this. Perhaps a lot of things that I haven't mentioned or even been aware of led me to the project that I am currently directing then, Patents as Scientific Information, 1895 to 2020, or PASSIM. Thank you.